Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Now I've had my associated TC8 for about 3 months and I have to confess it's been a bit of a challenge. As you can tell from the state of the body, it's had plenty of running and plenty of crashes. As I mentioned in my original build video, it was a bit tricky on the first run outdoors, but a few setup changes got it in the right kind of area. Then I added a few other parts and took it to the local small carpet club, and the car was undrivable, worse than anything I've put on the track in years. The back end was extremely loose and the car would grip roll with ease, even with the steering rates dialed right down. Over the next few weeks I tried loads of different setup changes that got it closer, until finally I decided to rebuild the whole thing down to the chassis plate and try again. Remarkably, the car was transformed and is finally where I expected it to be out of the box, which just goes to show that sometimes you need to start again from scratch. I thought it would make a good case study of how to deal with a car that isn't behaving itself. So in this video, I'll work my way through the whole of the car and show the changes I've made and the bits of the build that might need extra attention. I'll just mention a couple of general points about setting a car up that I'm sure many of you know already. Only do one change at a time so you can see the effect, and always check your ride height and the basic geometry such as the camber before you put the car back on the track. I'll start off at the front of the car and work my way back. Not for any particular reason, but you have to have some kind of order, right? First change has been to fit this foam bumper from T-Works, as well as their carbon fibre upper plate. I don't understand the trend for 3D printed bumpers at all. This one is much lighter and just as effective, and the carbon plate reduces the bulkhead flex a little, which I'll talk more about later. It also looks fancy. I've had some big hits already, and the bumper is holding out well. The front suspension is an area where I've made a lot of changes. One of my rules when working on a car is that if I don't understand a setting, I don't use it. The TC8 comes with adjustable kingpin inclination, or KPI, for the front hubs, which they've also been using on the B7 buggy. In practice, what this does is remove camber from the tyre as you increase the steering lock. I don't like the feel of this on the B7, so I removed it from the TC8 by taking out the spacers behind the top upper link. The other setting I don't understand is the trend for a longer front arm on touring cars. In my experience, a longer arm makes that end of the car more planted because there is less roll centre migration. Maybe this is faster if you're skilled enough to hang on to it, but at my skill level, I want the rear of the car to be more planted. Fortunately, the TC8 allows you to adjust the arm length with spacers, so I've reduced the length by 1mm so that all 4 arms are equal. Since you'd usually want the front track width of the car to be wider than the rear, again for stability, I've compensated for the shorter arm by fitting a 5mm front hex instead of the standard 4mm front hex. The standard roll centres on the TC8 are quite high out of the box, so I've dropped them all round by using the 0mm hubs instead of the +1. I'm also running a slightly higher front roll centre with 2mm under the inner arm compared to 1mm at the rear. This higher roll centre helps to take away some steering and stop the car from hooking in the middle of a corner. The lower roll centre overall helps to calm the car down and make it feel more like it's in the track rather than on the track. My basic setting for front droop using the 0mm hubs is 4mm measured under the bottom. That's using standard 10mm droop blocks and a standard marked droop gauge. I might reduce the amount of droop on a high grip surface, which would be a larger measurement under the hub, something like 5mm. For springs, I've been using either blue or yellow progressives on the front, mainly because of availability. I prefer to use linear springs all round, but to be frank, these progressive springs are not progressive in practice at all, as the winding is barely any different to the linear versions. I never run the kit grey springs on the front because they are far too soft. I've also lowered the diffs all round by using the lowest settings for the bearing carriers. Drive shaft angle is another setting that's massively overstated in terms of the impact it has, and I'd rather just have the weight low down and also better belt clearance around these lower suspension arms. When I did the complete rebuild of the car, I didn't find too many things that looked wrong, but one of them was that the screw holding the outdrive on this side had come a little loose, which let the outdrive move around a couple of degrees more than the other side, so that might be something to keep an eye on. Final change I've made to the front end is to eliminate the bulkhead flex. This is another tuning option that I don't understand. There's plenty of scope to adjust chassis flex using the top deck, and there's plenty of scope to adjust front suspension stiffness by using the springs. In my experience, all that happens with an unbraced bulkhead is that parts work loose during a run. This is a custom brace that I've had made, originally to go across the front bumper, but which I'm now using across the top of the bulkheads with a couple of small spaces underneath, and that really locks them solid. Working back to the steering assembly, the crank is a little sloppy, but even with a bit of shimming in there, there's not much you can do to stop it. And personally speaking, I don't mind a little free play in the linkages. It tends to help the car to be a little more settled on the track. I've also added a Tamiya servo saver for a little more shock protection indoors. But the biggest issue has proven to be the servo mount, which I thought was a little tricky to line up during the original build and has proven to be far too easy to knock out of position if you crash. 2 small screws and 1 pin just isn't enough to hold it in place. Fortunately, there is a reliable fix, and Associated actually provide the parts you need in the box. It's their thin 3M branded servo tape, which will just about fit in the small gap between the servo and the chassis. What I'd recommend is putting a small piece on the bottom of the servo and then getting a folded piece of baking paper to place on the other sticky side. Take your time lining up the servo mount. I do it by checking that the distance between the steering arm and the shocks is the same at full lock in both directions. Screw the mount down, pull the folded paper away, and the servo will stick firmly in place. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing, and I really hope Associated launch an upgraded servo mount in the near future. Quick note on the battery mountings. I've ended up spacing the low profile ones up with a few millimeters of extra spacers to be a good fit on my mid profile battery. You'll also need to find some slightly longer screws to make this happen. The motor mount is another area where I missed something on the original build. The kit top decks have small recesses for the heads of the special top deck screws, so you need to make sure that these recesses face up when you're installing the top decks. I've also secured both top decks with 2 screws. Again, if I don't understand the reason for something, I don't do it. There's no shortage of flex in the chassis, and I'd rather the parts were firmly attached to the bulkheads. I also noticed that my motor was rubbing against the chassis cutout underneath it. I could see marks on the chassis and also in the slots down here for the motor screws. This may also have been causing a small tweak. So I took a file to the chassis cutout on the other side and removed a small amount of material. The motor now slides backwards and forwards much more smoothly, although the clearance is still very close. The centre pulley hub is another part that caused a problem in the original build because the inner bearing in particular is a very tight fit and you're very likely to damage it during installation. In practice, it hasn't been a problem for me. The drivetrain itself is very free, and on the rare occasion that you do feel a small flat spot in the rotation of the pulley, it disappears again after a few more spins. It's still a substandard part from Associated, and I'm sure they know that. By the way, if you're looking for a spur gear that fits this car well, these are Aromax gears, and they work. Some brands will foul the screw head that holds the belt tensioner in place underneath here. You can probably also see that I've got a lot of ballast on the car. I've got these disc-shaped weights front and rear. I also have the steel receiver mount, and I also have the rear steel mount here. And you need to be aware with this rear steel mount that goes under the belt that there's actually a small step in it, so that if you use the screw to the rear here that I don't currently have installed, you need to make sure you put a 0.5 millimeter spacer in there as well to stop it from causing a tweak. I didn't realize that when I first put the weight in, so I may have caused myself some trouble with that. As it stands, I'm just using the single screw right next to the pin there because that's directly onto the chassis. Onto the rear suspension, and there are not quite as many changes as at the front. I'm basically matching the geometry front and rear with 0mm hubs and no KPI spacers on the top link here. The roll centre is lower than at the front with a 1mm spacer underneath the arm. The toe links are set to remove any dynamic toe change, which in this case means 3mm of spacers here, and these links are also set to give 3 degrees of toe in. The rear springs are either blue or grey linear springs, which are actually the 2 springs that come in the kit, and I'll switch between those depending on grip levels and the feeling of the car. The starting point for droop on the rear end for me is 3mm measured under the 0mm hub, and in higher grip conditions I might change that to something closer to 4mm. Finally, I've had a custom part made for a vertical body mount. Horizontal body mounts are another trend that I just don't understand. They've been around for at least 5 years now, and they're still no more useful than they were on the day they came out. Associated include these longer vertical posts in the kit, but funny enough, there's nothing to attach them to. A nice benefit of the shorter overhang at the rear you get from using the vertical body mount is that I can now point the car upwards to measure the rear toe on a board using a camber gauge. And that's where I am after a few months of testing and racing. The car has gone from being flighty and unpredictable to fast and consistent, although this is definitely a car you need to drive with precision because it goes exactly where you point it. I don't expect to make many changes to the geometry now that I've settled on it. Mostly I dial a car into the track with tyres, springs and rear toe in. So that's the end of this case study into getting a tricky car to handle. Hopefully you found it useful. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd click on the like button, and please consider subscribing to the channel as it really helps me out. As ever, thank you very much for watching.